Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm Niyati Dave, curator and program manager at Khoj, an transdisciplinary and experimental art space based in New Delhi. I'm joined today by Abhishek Hazra, who Khoj has had the pleasure of working with over the last few months on a commission for the stage platform. We began working with Abhishek through a process that got initiated when TBA 21 reached out to us and asked if we would be interested in implementing an open call. At the time, Khoj was looking at a project that examined the toxicity of air, specifically in New Delhi, but across the South Asian subcontinent. So the project that Abhishek has worked on for the stage platform is called the Aerosol Chronicles Capture Omlojan, and it's a 7-part exploration that looks into toxicities that swarm the air. And yeah, I'm very happy to be joined by Abhishek, who's here with us, and we're going to be talking about the many threads that run through his work and trying to unpack some of them right now. So I would really like to begin by talking about sort of the process of how the work was imagined, specifically by thinking through the structure of the work, because if you look at the video, which I'm hoping most of you do, the structure of the work carries within it multiple meta narratives and has different narrators as well as declarations and refutations of master narratives. And so I want to begin, Abhishek, by asking you about this sort of self-reflexive structure of the work and whether it's possible for you to maybe talk about, all of these meta layers and how they are entangled with each other and how you've been thinking about them as you progress through the process of making this work.
Of course, and thanks, of course, also to Coach and TBA for this opportunity. It has been quite a fascinating and interesting experience, especially with the pandemic kind of literally happening right through the project. So yeah, so this is also it's an interesting question. So it's difficult to say delineate all the various threads. So what I instead of trying to do that, what I will try to give you a glimpse or give you a sense is, what were some of the thinking that led to that particular self-reflexive structure that you have accurately identified. Now I have to also say that this kind of layered self-reflexivity is something that is there in many of my other works also, has been there. So that's you could say that's a kind of continuing thread in my practice. But I think one of the reason why it got particularly intensified in this work is because I think there was a concern. I was trying to focus. I was trying to move the focus more towards the invisible discursive structures that shape the experience of a climate emergency. So I think that was the starting point, and so this multiple layered structure was a way to give a sense of how these different discursive structures are kind of um, interlinked with each other. So you cannot kind of isolate, okay, that is the so-called quote unquote primary cause for what we are experiencing. So there are historical factors. So it was an attempt to kind of give a glimpse of this complex hinterland, so to speak, that that shapes this actual kind of visceral experience of a climate emergency. uh, so that I think was one of the primary motivation in one way. And I think you could also say that some of that also then influenced the some of the formal visual decisions in terms of the shaping of the work. As you will know, and as you know, I hope viewers who see the work will realize that there is a very conscious retreat from a certain kind of visuality. So there is no photographic material, or there is no direct video material, but also there is a strong sense of the visual, but it is directed towards the diagrammatic. So there is a profusion of various kinds of diagrams sourced from scientific maps, scientific diagrams, visualizations, traces of processes. So there are a whole host of variety of them. And I've always been interested in the diagrammatic, in how the abstractions of the diagrammatic kind of offers a certain other glimpse into schematization, into the relationships of abstraction between forces and actants. So that also, I think, offers another entry point, or another entry point into the structure of the work. So just as a small note, for instance, I think in the third or fourth episode, or part, to take the current nomenclature, the primary diagram that keeps appearing through various animation is that of the cadastral map. And the cadastral map is a particular kind of a diagram, or a particular kind of a map, which shows the property delimitations of a given plot of land. So that is, of course, used to settle property disputes, but also it has various other uses, as one would imagine. So, for instance, if one looks at the cadastral map of a certain agricultural plot, one immediately gets a sense of the kind of land holdings that are there, or kind of, so one then can, if one correlates it with tenurial records, so you get another glimpse into agrarian relations. So, again, that's a kind of a cadastral map is a certain sort of an abstraction, but yet it is very closely connected to some of the you know. Questions that the work engages with, and which is also connected to air pollution and the phenomena of agricultural practice and all of that. So yes, so the idea was to kind of give a glimpse into these other structures, so to speak, which I think then shapes the nature of the work.
I think what you said also in the beginning, when you just started speaking about kind of representing, or well, not representing, but really getting into thinking through the sort of different discursivities that inform, what it means to experience the climate crisis, but also think through it, because it's also a site where knowledge is produced and disseminated, and where knowledge informs actions. But
Right.
of course, knowledge is obviously not neutral. So I think this just makes me also think about the fact that the work that you've made, it has its own sort of overarching narrative structure, but it's also kind of temporal inquiry into, you know, in terms of its structure itself, it's attempting a reconstruction of a past through archival material, and through, in particular, the six objects that you invoke and
Right.
that you talk through. And I think this makes me think also about, this idea of knowledge production, and about the idea of the archival as a site for knowledge production. And I think I want to ask you more about your practice, which is long-standing, in which you look at histories of intellectual thought and engage with sort of fact and fiction around those histories. And because I think within this work as well, as you said, there's a clever sort of invocation of images, but there's also, you're working through presenting scientific fact and the idea of, contested knowledges, while also working with certain fictions within
Right.
the work itself. So I
Right.
think it might be interesting if maybe we could talk about what is your interest in approaching these histories in that sense, and in pulling them apart through speculation and fiction, or think or interrogating them in that particular way?
Okay, that's a fascinating question, but we could have an entire discussion only on this, because this is also a long-standing obsession or interest. I would say that, okay, let me try to address one aspect, that of course there's this tension between what is an actual fact and what is a speculation. How much is a speculation kind of out of thin air, so to speak, or how much is it an extrapolation, extrusion of existing factuality. And of course there is a lot of existing discourse and debates on this tension. So let me say that, okay, to kind of state, and whether the viewers will believe me or not is, of course, I leave that as a question. But I'm kind of stating, and it can be verified by the viewers, is that uh, almost all of the stuff that is from the natural sciences that you encounter in the work, the geological aspect, as well as some of the geochemistry and some of the chemical equations that you experience in the work, or which are proposed in the work. They are not kind of complete concoctions that I've just kind of created, but they are all very much based in actual existing scientific practices and processes, or existing reactions. So they are very much in the realm of the feasible and the plausible, including this kind of this speculative sculpture that is proposed and that performs a very important role in the work. So those are again based on chemical reactions, redox reactions, oxidation reduction reactions, and many of the geological aspect also are based on existing scientific debates. And here I also want to acknowledge my conversation and inputs uh, from two of the scientists who have spoken to during the kind of conceptualization of the work. One is Dr. Ram Ramaswamy from IIT Delhi, and the other is Dr. Richard Zare, who is a professor of chemistry at Stanford. Ram, of course, has been always a great supporter of the arts and artistic practice, and I have had the pleasure of interacting with him earlier. And he was, in fact, the one who introduced me to Dr. Zaire. And Dr. Zaire also, it was kind of very fascinating and exciting to discuss his own research and his own thoughts about origin of life and early terrestrial environments. And but then when I kind of created this particular scenario and created this particular kind of speculative structures. Some of it I drew upon Dr. Zaire's own research in air pollution and the effects it has, and some of those papers will be linked in the research cluster for those of you who are interested. But I kind of, of course, took his research. I did not, but I kind of quote unquote applied it in a very different way. And I was initially a little hesitant to see how he would kind of respond to a very different take on his work, while again still being within the realms of the scientifically plausible. So, but yeah, I think he completely enjoyed that particular reading or that particular interpretation, or it's kind of taking it into that other direction. And we had a very interesting conversation on some of this. So for me, it is precisely this tension that I think also is very important to the work. Is that because otherwise the speculation is perhaps not. It is because it is kind of has these grounding, or is anchored, so to speak, in some of these actual material practices, is that those extrapolations has or acquires a certain attention. Because if it was only that, without being anchored to some of these actual material practices, then I think it would be a different sort of thing. I'm not again making any sort of a value judgment. There can be works which explore speculation in that mode, but I'm kind of interested in this kind of an interplay. So yes, I think throughout the work, in all the episodes, that plays out. And I think also to kind of this also goes back a little bit to the first to your first question, more to the kind of structure of the work, is that this episodic sequential structure, this 6+1, so to speak, a 7-part one, the first one being the more of the prelude, allows one to then explore this more in a more sustained manner. That it is almost like one of the things that was in my mind was, it was like a protocol, a lab protocol that you follow. If you're in the lab doing a particular, say, biochemistry experiment or a biological experiment, then if you want to do a particular kind of a titration, or if you want to do a particular sort of a reaction, then there are these particular protocols that you have to follow, which involves that there is a certain milligram of certain reagent that you bring together. So and it all can't be done at once, one step. So for me, this sequentiality also had a certain kind of it came from that sort of a thinking, which also then grounds the work in a certain way, and which is why also we had long conversations on what is the best way someone can experience the work on the stage platform, which is why you experience the work in this kind of playlist mode, where you go through the work in a particular sequence. Of course, if one does a different sort of a navigation, then one has a different experience, and I'm hoping that viewers will come back for a second or a third viewing, and then they can have their other sort of navigation through it. But yeah, I think that kind of close engagement with existing scientific practices offers one particular kind of entry point into this fact and fiction question.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting interplay, because I do feel like what really worked for me was that there is this sense of a context that's happening, that everything that your work touches upon is happening within, and it's very hard to temporally or spatially place the context. So
Right.
that becomes sort of the speculative bit. But then, of course, and I think what's really great in some sense about how um, folks might actually encounter it is that if they do go on to read Dr. Zair's papers, some of the more outlandish parts of the work, or seemingly outlandish parts,
Right.
turn out to be fact.
Right.
While so I think that kind of sense of also not knowing where to sort of suspend belief, or not knowing where the fictionality comes in, works really well in some sense. Because I think also, even when we talk about the climate crisis, there's always this sense of incredulity until something happens. And even post the fact, there is not, like, it's always that dystopia or disaster is imagined in the future. I think it's much easier to wrap your head around disaster that's happening in the present
Right.
without necessarily doing much about it. So I
Yeah.
think for me, that part of your work was incredibly compelling and also very fun. I got a real kick out of some of the institutions you imagine.
I have had a long-standing fascination with cyanobacteria. So that's and I have tried to grow cyanobacteria in the lab and have failed multiple times, but yet persisted. And I started doing that when I had this residency at Symbiotica in Perth, in Australia. And the entire process of getting the correct ocean water to create the culture for the cyanobacteria, and then going out and then actually getting these huge cans of ocean water, uh, and then kind of tending to these fragile, otherwise fragile bacteria. So yes, and that fascination with cyanobacteria found another mode of expression, if you will, in this work. I will not go more into the what role the cyanobacteria plays. I think that I will leave to the for the viewers to kind of actually see the work.
That's, I don't think we've talked about that, so it's really fun to hear about it because, yeah, particular ocean water. I really wonder what conducive to cyanobacteria ocean water looks like.
Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of cell cultures, and it's nutrient medium, etc. It's a kind of many factors are at play. Some of the details escape me, and I can share more with you later, possibly. Yeah.
I think maybe going from there, another thing that I've been thinking about is that maybe we can talk about this idea because I think there's like two things happening. There's and a lot of it might seem oblique, right? Like I'm just thinking about encountering the work because even as you speak, and I think this is a discussion we've had before. I think my reading of the work is a little more obsessed with the world building and speculation aspect of it. And I think, like you mentioned, your obsession with the cyanobacteria, my prior obsession with geology got me really kicked when you started talking about, the banded iron formations and this
Right.
idea that they tend to be what I guess where the world's industrial kind of source of steel and iron. And then we're talking also about on the larger scale, talking about air pollution. So this, sense of cyclical kind of feeling of that informing what goes into the air became kind of an interesting thing to think about. I don't think the work doesn't comment on it so much, but of course you know, that is what you would think through when you encounter the work. There's also this sense of, like you said, somebody, and I remember Dr. Zair's reaction to it as well, and him thinking through, like, um, him kind of commending the fact that you had managed to portray the sort of to be true to the idea of what was plausible and what wasn't within what he and you had talked about. So I think somebody coming at it from that sort of background is of course going to read it very differently. In that sense, it's a very generative work. And I think a particular kind of thing that is also interesting to me is that this extends also to the idea of language, because I think someone coming from a South Asian context is going to tune in immediately to the sort of things you do with language, especially with vernacular language. Maybe be familiar if somebody speaks an Indian language, and even within that, if somebody speaks a particular Indian languages.
Right. Right.
I mean, language obviously plays an important role within the work, and specifically vernacular languages, right? So, I think something that I've been thinking about is that there is no explicit mention of it, or I mean, of course, but there's no. I think there's this interplay of kind of what is transparent to somebody and what is opaque, and in some sense,
Right.
the vernacular languages remain opaque. And I kind of want to learn a little more about, what role, how you thought through this role of vernacular language throughout the work, because it does, it does come in. I think the fourth or fifth episode onwards, it begins to become kind of central to the
Right.
soundscape of the work.
So yes, I mean, regional languages, or South Asian languages, are or multilinguality itself is, I think, very important to me, to my practice, and I think the the sheer thought of Anglophone monolingualism or monolinguality, I think, is kind of a horrific thought. Uh, in terms of cultural imagination, in terms of the political implications of that. So, of course, that played a very important role in the entire conception of the work. And so, let me try to respond by possibly, say, recapitulating this particular sequence that you're referring to. Essentially, without kind of detailing out too much. Very very schematically, what happens here in these situations, in these kind of scenarios, is that there is this drone like chanting uh, that happens in Bengali, and for certain stretches of time that drone like chant overpowers and completely obscures the other narrative voice which is there in the video. And for someone, then there is no other access to the narrative voice apart from the subtitle. So one can still get a sense of what is kind of happening, so to speak, but with that voice itself being obscured. It's not completely inaudible, because if one strains one's ears, and hopefully if one uses a headphone, then it's even more interesting in terms of the different audio levels. It's not completely inaudible. One can still get a sense of what is being spoken, but it will be very difficult to follow. There is no additional subtitle that is offered to get a sense of what is being chanted, right? And then this situation again dissolves, and then one is back to how things were, with the narrative voice being foregrounded, but yet this chanting one presence is there again in the background. So there is this kind of alternating shift between foreground and background that keeps alternating. Now, one would think, if one is not familiar with this particular South Asian language, and Bengali, of course, is constricted only to one nation state. It exceeds specific, singular nation state boundaries, like even Tamil. So one would think, just by the sonic texture, that it is some sort of a liturgical text, so to speak, that is being chanted. But in fact, what is being recited are fragments from a chemistry textbook, a chemistry primer, a Bengali chemistry primer from the early 19th century. And this was a Bengali translation that was done by the Srirampur Baptist missionaries, the Christian missionaries there. And Srirampur is a very important trading town, now a kind of suburb of Calcutta. And it has what many scholars have called as a kind of a polycolonial history. You could, in some way, it has a particular interesting Danish history. You could say that it's like the eastern counterpart of Tranquebar in the south. So this particular Srirampur mission also has had a very important influence in the colonial, and in this case, I'm talking more about the English, British colonial history, with the colonial reconstruction of Bengali as a codified, standardized language with its own dictionary and grammar, and standardized orthography and all of that. But the kind of in this process of colonial reconstruction, what happened was that this new Bengali that was created was a very strange concoction. It was a very strange construction, which was very many miles away from the actual Bengali that was being spoken in the streets and the bazaars. So this was a hyper Sanskritized, elite construction of the language, and of course process through which this happened, where these colonial missionaries, in conjunction with the native informants, who were primarily the pundits and the priestly interlocutors, who were kind of primarily responsible in this process. So what happened was this strange new Bengali that was constructed alienated many of the significant sections of actual Bengali speakers who were a much more kind of hybrid and plural constituency, so to speak. And the problematic aspects of such a kind of reductive reconstruction is something that we are in many ways still dealing with, and it's a kind of continuing legacy. So that is why a primer on chemistry can be made to sound like this liturgical chant, because what happened was that many of these texts, many of these early translated texts, were written in this kind of bizarre, hyper Sanskritized Bengali, which was almost like a Bengali which is wanting to be Sanskrit while maintaining a certain facade of being technically Bengali in some of its syntax. So while reading this text, it struck me that what happens when this democratizing, seemingly universal spirit of the scientific enterprise gets communicated through this highly hierarchical language. What happens? So that was one of the kind of questions I wanted to explore. And so which is why this very consciously reperforming those texts as kind of reframing them as a liturgical chant. So, and of course there are other questions at play here which I won't get further into now, but I think one can read the subtext that is at play. And in some ways one can also say that there was an attempt to somehow re-perform, as it were, some of the obfuscations that are at play in the kind of colonial constructions of knowledge formations. Some of these seemingly invisible obfuscations that are there in these colonial knowledge formations. So that was also one of the aspects. Although I have to while on this point, again, I don't want to go into great detail, but I think it has to be mentioned that when acknowledging this colonial influence on knowledge formations, one has to be also extremely careful and vigilant that such an acknowledgement of the colonial power does not necessarily imply an endorsement of this other kind of preposterous claim that in egalitarian structures that continue to be with us, which in egalitarian social structures which have not been yet annihilated, that all of these inegalitarian structures are merely colonial fiction, that they do not really exist, and they are just artifacts of this colonial discourse process. That's a very problematic and politically hugely problematic position, and I don't want to kind of have any of the viewers think that that's the position that I'm kind of aligned to. Definitely not. So I just wanted to kind of make that also very clear.
Yeah, I think two things stand out to me. One is your clarification, because I think decolonizing knowledge also becomes fraught when your other option is entrenched in hierarchies that exist within your
Yeah.
post-colonial context. And I think that's a tension that in some sense you also explore through the work in thinking about the idea of oral histories and thinking about other modes of knowledge production that seem like they are moving towards a certain kind of decolonial imagination, but are using the sort of tools and methods and also interlocutors of previously held hierarchies. So I think a really important thing. And I think that another thing you mentioned was this idea of how certain, when you were talking about the history of Bengali and how it got Sanskritized into a very particular form of Bengali that, in some sense, excluded and was alien to a lot of the speakers of it. And this is also a process that has happened to a lot of other languages, is also happening. Like there's a flattening effect in some sense when you try to officialize anything. Thinking also of Bihari languages all being called Bihari, which
Right.
is again a major erasure of so many vernaculars. And I think, in some sense, this is also, I mean, when we kind of open up this question and think about it on a larger scale, of who codifies language and who gets to be an interlocutor, it also leads into questions of thinking about translation and how translation, or that sort of codification that attempts to, make knowledge travel across context, can itself become an agent of reduction, or, in some sense, become a way in which essentializing tropes get fixed. I think, yeah, so that's just the sort of thoughts that I'm thinking about based on what we've been talking through.
Right. I think, and I think, your response to this other, the my previous, what I was trying to talk about, I think is absolutely spot on. And as you can realize, there are various reasons why I'm not, explicating it further, because one, I think it's explored significantly in the work. So I would really urge the viewers to experience it. But yes, this the problematic nature of certain, appropriation of the decolonial narrative is, I think, is something that we should be all extremely cautious about. So, and it's kind of, again, connected to the translation question. Um, See, in one way, one could say that when one is talking about, when one is engaging within a certain multilingual context, translation is a kind of default given, right? It's a you cannot think without translation, and for me, this entire question of untranslatability is also something that I find fascinating, and which is, it is kind of referred a bit in the work also, uh, that this, because translation in many ways is this kind of, impossible project that one yet must still do, that you know that you are, as a translator, you know that you are dealing with an, untranslatable, but yet you must still kind of, work, strain against that impossibility. So that entire aspect I find very fascinating. And also, I think one of the concerns in the work was to also critique or work against this notion of smooth, friction free translatability, uh, which is something that one encounters in certain sorts of international civil society discourse, uh, which assumes a certain, this, friction free translatability of certain concepts, because uh, translation, because languages encompass entire worldviews, translation can never be a mere technical algorithmic question. So I'm kind of interested, and this is explored in the work, in precisely this, the frictions and the contestations around translation. So what happens when certain majoritarian cultural practices get advertised as local knowledges within a global international context? So what happens then? What sort of silences get then institutionally structured? So yes, so I think, this question of translation is not just a technical one. I mean, it's very much a political question, and it's connected to these other knowledge and discursive formations, which are, unfolding as we speak. This is not only something that happened in the kind of, 200 years back. And also to connect it with another question is that attending to questions of translation or to the difficulties of translation sometimes also gives us a more nuanced historical understanding. For instance, if you look at and this is something we have spoken offline earlier in one of our other discussions, is that if you look at this differences between science, the Anglo-Saxon, English word science, and the German term Wissenschaft, they are often treated as equivalents, but the worldviews that inform them are very different. In the kind of Anglo-Saxon English understanding of science, there is an implicit, kind of almost privileging of the natural sciences as the kind of privileged, the grand royal pathway to truth, so to speak. Whereas that sense, that privileging of the natural sciences is not there in the kind of larger understanding of Wissenschaft, which encompasses other forms of systematic inquiry and understanding. So just this aspect and gives one an entry point into thinking about that sciences as experience or encounter today are also a particular historical construct. And I think it's very important to kind of not forget that historical aspect without highlighting or foregrounding that historically constructed nature of scientific practice is not to kind of get into strange conspiracy theories. So it's not that you are getting away from this quote unquote scientific temper or something. But I think it's very important to kind of attend to the to kind of critique and be skeptical about this apolitical, ahistorical understanding of science. It's a kind of I'm trying to kind of take the translation question and open it up, but I think these are also questions of translation understood in a bit more broader perspective.
I think so. What's particularly interesting is, as you said, like this idea of, like language encompasses a worldview, and also what you said about kind of thinking through histories of science and thinking through also the way in which language is mobilized through certain kind of forms of pinning down practices and basically encoding them into what happens. It just takes me also to this question that you have within your work of thinking through colonial histories of insurgent farmers and of codifying farmers or peasants rather as insurgents in this very particular way, and that kind of factors into your work and is also makes, and I think it comes from a broader inquiry into thinking about scientific forestry and the different kind of relationships it mediates between land and people living within that, and how some of those relationships are also something that we see being contested and becoming a part of things that are going on right now. Yeah, so I think that just kind of made me think about how there's a way in which the sort of perceived neutrality of some of these formations that have emerged from a very particular historical colonial context are also things that people are living with today and trying to navigate, and also brushing up against in these various sort of contestations. So yeah, I was just thinking that through, but I think that also leads me in some sense to talking about the process of the work, because I believe we began speaking to each other almost a year ago. And
Yeah.
at that point, we were in a very different place. The pandemic had sort of well, it hadn't just begun, but we were still working our way through it. I don't think we saw what was coming in some sense. And in India, the farmers' protest that we saw had also not yet begun, even while your work kind of touched upon thinking through farming practices, agrarian practice, some of those questions. So I think your work has been very interesting in that sense because it's almost prescient. I mean, in some sense, like there's two sides to it. One is the sort of what's happening with the farmers, and then the second is also thinking about, how, because your work obviously thinks very clearly about this idea of, I mean, Omlojan as oxygen, so oxygen capture kind of protocols, and it's also an extended inquiry into thinking about, breathing itself not being apolitical, and thinking through bodies and how they encounter the environment, and how none of these relationships are outside of how capital and commodities circulate or are manipulated. So, I mean, even as your work was not made or born specifically from this context, it's unfolded throughout it. So I kind of wanted to ask, has working on this while also having to deal with what's been happening outside of your work informed it, or what has it been like thinking through these questions while all of these things are happening?
It's been challenging and perplexing, and it's very strange because to kind of see it unfold in that way, um, because I don't think I have fully yet. I'm still wrapping my head around it. Something that was very much in the work, then suddenly you see it like literally out there in the world. But one small kind of addendum or postscript which I want to say is that when I was talking about these fragments from this chemistry, a Bengali translated chemistry primer, is that many of these fragments which are re-performed as chants, they actually talk about omlojan and oxygen and the chemical attributes of oxygen, the chemical reactivity of what oxygen does, what kind of reactions it can take place in oxygenated environments, etc. So yes, so I, in many ways, how to kind of deal with this kind of entire specter of topicality. I don't think I have any coherent answer. But one thing I do want to respond is that the work was more or less completed by January. Uh, and I think early February, I was doing some last bits of color correction and audio post production. So by mid February, the work was complete and ready to be released. And now we know that it is precisely in mid-February when the second wave of the pandemic was beginning to pick up momentum. And of course, the second wave has been brutal and tragic. And I think, many of us are still yet to begin the process of, processing what the enormity, the sheer enormity of what happened. So while I think towards the end of the second wave, it struck me that there is a possibility that the work, Omlujan, could be misread or could be interpreted as being disrespectful to the memory of those who lost their lives due to the oxygen crisis. Those who could have been with us today, but who are not because they could not get access to oxygen on time. And when that realization struck me, I was kind of almost paralyzed but then I realized that this misreading would be more connected to the kind of first part of the work, because that's where there is an attempt to open up the standard assumption or standard connection of oxygen with kind of human lives or human respiration
Or
and
life in general,
yeah,
biological life.
biological life, and to open up to kind of look at oxygen as toxicity also, because oxygen can be toxic for other forms of life, which are still life forms, but not human life forms. So all of those speculations, which are again based on actual kind of biochemical processes, uh, but trying to kind of create a certain, one, quote unquote, a post-humanist conception of oxygen, as it were. So all of those are there in the first part. And then I started thinking that hopefully viewers would also engage with the entirety of the work, will engage with the entire duration of the work, and hopefully then they will realize that the other parts of the work also then mounts a critique on precisely the assumptions that inform such an attempt at this post-humanist trope. And hopefully the entirety of the work will not get kind of reduced to just its first part, and viewers will be able to get a sense of the different contradictory threads that structure the work.
Mm-hmm.
So I will not try to kind of elaborate further on that contradiction, but I think in many ways that contradiction is some way constitutive of the work itself, that it is kind of it unfolds through that contradiction. And I think some of it also emerged from one of my other long-standing interests, or question that has intrigued me for many years, is that how does one engage with the kind of legacy of the philosophical legacy of the anti-humanist critique of liberal humanism, while also protesting against the inhuman massacre of actual human lives. And when that massacre of human lives comes from a very particular inegalitarian worldview. But I think that also kind of fundamentally informed the contradiction that one sees unfolding in the work.
It's been quite interesting also just to think through some of the questions that the work brings up. And like I said, I think when we were talking about how just the way nature of the work itself, it's so expansive, it can become a site for many rereadings, and it's something that you really need to sit with and work around. And each time you encounter it, also you read something new into it, you get something new out of it. So, and I think this is just sort of one more additional thing that we've been thinking through as we've been working on it through the pandemic.
Right.
um, yeah, and I think it's also a good invitation to ask everybody watching this to engage with the work and rewatch it a couple of times, because I'm sure you'll get something new out of it each time.